And we begin. Hi, everyone, to our in-house audience and also our viewers. So before the first panel, we will have a short introduction by Barbara Kolm. Barbara is the heart behind the Free Market Roadshow. I was in a tour with some old-timers who've been in many Free Market Roadshows, and whenever we're in a restaurant and would say, they would say, here to Barbara. So you're very much appreciated among the freedom movement in Europe. So, Barbara, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Nikos, but it's not actually to my name, but it's to freedom. This is what we toast to and where we celebrate and discuss. And this year's is the 15th anniversary of the Roadshow. We started out, again, 15 years in 4 cities. This year we're doing more than 35 cities across Europe. We're also planning to go abroad across the pond. But this year's topic is the freedom variant. And as you can see, and as we have heard, we were always on time and up to date with our topics. We debated the financial clash of 2008 and actually disguised as what it was, the sovereign debt crisis. We debated the migration crisis in 2013 already, long before it hit Europe, from a libertarian pro-market perspective. And of course, we were operating the past 2 years during the COVID lockdowns virtually, and started with live events last year. But this year we thought, well, we need to discuss freedom in all ways. And we've seen many external shocks, not only the war in Ukraine, but the lockdown crisis, what this has done to Europe and what it has done to not only our continent and Great Britain especially, but to the world. And I think one thing is most important: we need to defend our individual and entrepreneurial freedoms, because if we don't do that, it's too late when we realize that we have lost it. We need to do it right now. And I'm just thankful to our partners here, to the Ayn Rand Center in London, to host us and to discuss with us. And you have brought great speakers from across the world, literally, to debate in those 2 panels. And I'm just simply handing over to you again, Nikos. It's great to partner with you, and we're looking forward to many, many other events. And please do join us, freemarket-rs.com on the one side, but also on the Ayn Rand Center's website. Post questions, ask us, make use of our great speakers, their knowledge, and debate with them, discuss with them, learn, and especially spread the word of freedom. Thank you.
Okay, also to encourage our online audience, they can ask questions, super chats, and also we have now YouTube members, so they get the priority with the questions. Okay, so the first panel is about how should a free country deal with aggressors. This issue obviously became very prominent now with Ukraine, but there are more aggressors, not only Russia, so let's see what the take will be. So, our speakers. First, Eamonn Butler. Eamonn is a director of the Adam Smith Institute, one of the most esteemed, if not the most esteemed, free market think tank in the UK. Eamonn has has written about the work of people like Mises, Hayek, classical liberals, and go to the website. There are so many books, I won't even start mentioning them. Then we've got Dan Mitchel from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Dan is a public policy economist. You have written for many outlets. You've worked for the Cato Institute. You've been a voice for freedom, focusing on issues of tax for many years. And then we have Zhao Schoolland from the Acton Institute. Li, you were in China. You escaped one oppressive regime. So you are speaking about freedom in Asia, about education. And when we talk about aggressors, many people believe that China is the next big threat after Russia. So very interested to hear what you have to say. And at the far left, we've got Razi Ginzberg. Razi is the director of Ayn Rand Center UK. He's the host of today's event. And Ayn Rand Center UK is the most vibrant objectivist community outside of the US. So great work, Razi. Okay, short introductions and then inter-panel discussion and questions from the audience. Eamonn, thank you very much. With the micro, now it's good.
But it was in the charter. Yeah, it could be.
Yep, right, it's making noise. So where shall I put this, do you think? Let's see it. Let me try that. Is that working for you? Yeah, great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. In terms of what we do to defend our liberal values against those who would oppose them, I think there are 7 priorities which I've jotted down. Firstly, it's entirely legitimate for a liberal society to defend itself, and indeed that is one of the priorities of a liberal government and a liberal nation is to defend its citizens against aggression at home or abroad. And that actually means being tough, being strong. Reagan and Thatcher, for example, put cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe against a great deal of opposition in Europe so that they could negotiate with Russia from a position of nuclear equality. So you have to be strong. Secondly, you have to remember that you can't talk people out of what they regard as being their national interest. You know, for example, just the Russian view of Ukraine. The Russian view of Ukraine is that it's not a real country, it's always been part of Russia, and that it's being abused by the West, and that there's a possibility of it joining the European Union and indeed joining NATO, and that means that there's a possibility of troops and indeed missiles right on the border with Russia. It's very hard to talk them out of that point of view, and if they regard that as being essential to their own lives and interests, then it's hard to negotiate that kind of thing away from people. So you've got to be aware of people's sensibilities and where they're coming from. The third thing I would say is that if you can't reach agreement on these things, you need to be willing to walk away. You need to be willing to walk away and actually admit that you've got an enemy and treat them as an enemy. If they're not going to talk, then you've got to do something else. You know, for example, Iran with its nuclear program. France and Germany tried diplomacy. France and Germany in particular tried diplomacy. Everybody tried diplomacy, but that failed. When Obama was elected in the United States, he revived talks because, you know, by that time we weren't talking to them at all. We imposed sanctions. But again, Iran realized that the West wanted a deal more than they did. And if you're in that position where you're desperate to get a deal, then people can walk all over you. So Iran didn't give up its missiles, and now, of course, it's been attacking our allies in the region. Trump, of course, withdrew from the agreement and imposed new sanctions. But, of course, again, the old guard are now back in Washington, and Iran is now enriching uranium. Well, surprise, surprise. So you've actually got to be, you've got to be tough, you've got to be willing to walk away, and you've got to be willing to make an enemy of somebody. France, again, tried negotiations with Russia regarding Ukraine. It was hopeless. If anything, it just made them look naive. So that's the third point. Fourth point is you've got to keep your enemies guessing. And the fifth one is don't encourage them. Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, made it risky for Russia to attack the United States. And that was the one thing that Reagan was told he couldn't give up in the Reykjavik talks because of the uncertainty it put on Russia that, okay, they could fire their missiles, but maybe none of them would get through. So that's not a road you want to go down. And again, look at Trump in and how he dealt with Kim. For years and years, the Chinese have been inscrutable, but Trump is also inscrutable. You never quite know what he's going to do next. And so that made, when Kim started firing off test missiles and Trump started talking tough, then China was not very certain what was going to happen. So Kim was put on the next train to Beijing, giving a talking to, and that was the end of that. We did nothing in Chechnya and Georgia and Crimea, and so it's not surprising that Putin thought, okay, well, I can march into Ukraine, nothing's going to happen. So keep your enemies guessing what you're going to do and don't encourage them. Sixthly, I think, remember that we're not fighting for land. We're fighting for the principle that aggression does not succeed. This is what Britain did in the Falklands War. A little bit of land in the middle of the South Atlantic, very little use to anybody really, but it was British, and you can't just go in and with your troops and take it over. And there was an importance in winning that fight for the whole of the Cold War conflict. And the seventh thing I would say is that we liberals actually have the advantage. We believe in a diffused, diverse society. We're not top-down. The NATO command structure, for example, is people on the ground make the decisions. It's not top-down like the Russian system. And that gives us a huge adaptability and a huge benefit when it comes to defeating our enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamonn. Done.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, keep going as long as it keeps working. Well, thank you very much. In discussing how the West should deal with adversaries, the first thing we have to do is figure out who is an adversary. It's very simple when you have a Hitler. But what if there was no Hitler and there was just a Mussolini? Was Mussolini just a run-of-the-mill fascist thug but wasn't planning on killing many people? Who knows? We can't guess these things. 10 years ago in the United States, everyone was pretty optimistic about the future of relations with China. We expected China to sort of evolve gradually like some other East Asian economies did and become more democratic, more open, more free market. But now, 10 years later, today, on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, there is much, much more universal skepticism about China. But whenever Xi departs the scene, will China go back to evolving in what everyone expected to be a positive direction? And likewise, the same principle holds true with Russia. At some point, Putin will be gone. Many people hope the oligarchs or the military or someone takes him out. But even if he stays in power, at some point, Putin will be gone just from old age. And then the question becomes, does Russia go back toward maybe slowly evolving into a better, more market-oriented, friendly society? We just don't know. And it's very difficult to predict these things ahead of time. Now, we have these big debates in the United States. And it goes way beyond hawks versus doves, because are you a neocon, and what does that mean? Are you a realist, and what does that mean? And then are you a libertarian? But that's even unclear what that means in terms of how you deal with the world. But let me, in just 2 minutes here, wrap it up by making it very operational and looking specifically at what's happening both in Ukraine today and potentially what might be happening in Taiwan tomorrow. And I'll give you something that I think is part of the thinking in Washington, D.C. There has been a much bigger, stronger response to Putin going into Ukraine compared to, as Eamonn said, doing nothing when he went into Georgia, when he took over Crimea and stuff like that. The American foreign policy establishment, and I think they're right on this, one of the reasons they are being so hard against Putin and offering so much help to Ukraine, and the sanctions being much stronger and much more extensive than we've ever seen, compared to what's happened with Cuba and Venezuela, that's nothing. I mean, this is real hardship being imposed on Russia. And of course, when you're doing sanctions, you're imposing some hardship on yourself in order to have your enemies suffer even more. But one of the reasons that is happening is because there's a signal being sent to China that if you go after Taiwan, you are going to, in effect, be decoupling yourself from the Western economy. Now, Russia has more power, I think, in this situation than China, because Russia has energy. People want energy. What does China have? It has cheap goods. Nothing wrong with cheap goods. Trade is good as a general principle, and I think we'll be hearing more about this in the next panel. As a general principle, you don't want sanctions in the global economy, you don't want trade restrictions in the global economy, but that assumes you have a peaceful global economy. Well, unfortunately, and again, with all the uncertainty that comes with predicting different leaders and who's going to succeed them, right now there's a lot more pessimism about the future of major power interactions. And when you have that kind of situation and you want to discourage, say, China, because Russia, to be honest, probably doesn't have the ability to project force beyond its immediate neighbors. But China, I think, has been evolving toward where it does foresee itself being a global superpower. And if we want to discourage China from misbehaving, then indeed we have to sacrifice temporarily some of our principles of free markets and no sanctions in order to discourage something that could do much, much greater damage to the global economy in the long run. Thank you.
Well, talking about China, I think you said United States, the strong reaction is showing their attitude let China know. But I think it's a little bit too late, because 4 years ago when Hong Kong, people are fighting for democracy, the world was so quiet, did nothing, almost did nothing. I remember the people in Hong Kong, they were having these Trump pictures and United States flags. Say, please help us, please do something. Nobody did a thing. Then I was very surprised how strong the reaction internationally, especially in the United States. I'm not talking about just the government, it was the private business people. The MasterCard, the Visa card, the Apple, the McDonald's. If they did any of these things in Hong Kong, China will not be strong today, like today. Because I think the world treated Hong Kong as a part of China, but Hong Kong is not. And Hong Kongers don't think they're Chinese. Especially the Great Britain didn't act at all. I was so sad. And so a little bit too late, but I think Xi Jinping and Putin, they planned this thing really carefully together. For the past 10 years, Putin and Xi Jinping met for 20 times. I didn't meet my immediate family that much. They're very intimate. And Putin planned this attack after the Winter Olympic. And so everything is pre-planned, Xi Jinping and Putin together. In China, we all talk about that. We all know. And but I think too late is better than nothing. So I think Xi Jinping is thinking twice right now. And that's why he's going crazy to crack down Shanghai. Because Shanghai is the richest city in China, the most educated, have 150,000 foreigners live there. And now the foreigners are leaving, foreign businesses leaving, because just like what Deng Xiaoping did in 1989, I'd rather save the Communist Party than save the economy or people's life. That's why he ordered a tanks march on the Tiananmen Square. Xi Jinping is doing that. He already sacrificed Hong Kong. He said, we have Shenzhen. We don't need Hong Kong, but he didn't know Hong Kong, the investors there, the foreigners there, because Hong Kong still had a rule of law. Shenzhen has none. Now businesses are leaving Hong Kong and businesses are leaving China. Yesterday, Yahoo left China. So I think I'm not too big of a government sanction, but I think private business people should do things. Just like Yahoo did, leaving. A lot of Japanese companies, they were the first went to China in 1970s, and they all left. Like Matsushita and these big companies. So China is a threat. Xi Jinping, he doesn't care about people's life. He will do crazy things just to save his face and show off his so-called power because he's so afraid. He's so uncertain. That's why he's doing all these crazy things. And I hope when something happens in Taiwan or China, the free countries will do something, like the same reaction about Ukraine, not like Hong Kong, but I'm not certain.
So before I also share my many criticisms of how the West deals with adversaries, I do want to say that the attitude towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, it's surprisingly good. And part of the reason why I'm surprised is what Lee mentioned. We saw something similar with Hong Kong, and we didn't see a similar response from the West. The West was quiet, and I think, by the way, the West was very unfortunately very quiet since '97, where they shouldn't have let China take Hong Kong to begin with. That's where the decline started. But even looking at how the West is reacting to the war in Ukraine, are we on the right side for the right reasons, or is it for the wrong reasons? Is it because Ukraine is an underdog, or because for the same reasons the West, unfortunately, many in the West support the Palestinians, even though I would question whether they're the underdog. This is a big part. So there's no fundamental thinking about who are our allies in terms of what are the principles that guide them. What type of regime are we dealing with before they go to war? So I would think, like, the question would Mussolini have been an adversary if there was no Hitler? Yes, because of how he treated his own people. Like, you don't want to deal with people like that at all to begin with, as far as I'm concerned. And I think back to like a year and a half ago when Israel signed these so-called peace deals with the Emirates, which calling it peace deal was a bit weird because it was, there was no war there. It was just establishing diplomatic relations. It was a kind of a marketing trick to call it a peace deal. But there was a reaction from some in the West saying, this is legitimizing Israel. I mean, legitimizing Israel, look at the Middle East. It's you know, it's all disgusting. There is no respect for individual rights whatsoever, except a little bit, you know, to some extent in Israel. So I think, yeah, there's no, you know, there's no sort of moral certainty in Western principles being right, which is why when the West engages in war, or you know, observes a war and has to take a side, it's never done with moral clarity. I think the response to 9/11 is a good example, because there was a clear attack on the U.S. and you know, there was an attack in 1941, and the U.S. declared war the next day. This time, the U.S. was going around basically looking for allies, asking for everybody to back them, meeting. I think Bush, the first people he met with were the Saudis, who, you know, I think probably should have been the first ones to be bombed, and not, nobody should have met with them. He picked sort of, there were a few potential, you know, targets, I think, after 9/11, and Bush picked the easiest one to get a coalition around. And it took a month before anything was done, and the first thing that was, you know, dropped on Afghanistan was food and medicine. It was, you know, apologetic from the start. And yeah, this is, I think, why, you know, even stronger countries at war don't, you know, don't win decisively, because they don't think they're right. And if you don't think you're right, you're not gonna, you know, you're not gonna fight as if you think you're right, which is why, going back to the example of Israel, you know, the reason Israel, every time it has its one of these you know, battles with the Palestinians, they don't win those because they're very apologetic. You'll hear IDF spokespeople saying Israel is the most moral, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And when you ask for an explanation, the explanation is, you know, they don't bomb civilians, and they go out of their way to protect civilians on the enemy's side, so far as, you know, to send soldiers to a, in some cases, certain death to avoid the death of civilians on the other side. And obviously, a part of the result is you also avoid killing the people who are killing you. So I do take the attitude towards Israel in the West as kind of the a benchmark to how the West views its own kind of system, its own culture, in terms of whether whether we're actually better than, you know, people who abuse their own people. So yeah, I have more to say, but I'll leave it for later. And I want to encourage people who are watching us on YouTube to ask questions via Super Chat, or if you're a member, you can ask a question and just put the Nikos emoji after your question, so Nikos will acknowledge it and ask a question. Thanks.
Can I start some discussion? Because we've had a relatively hawkish panel so far. And as a libertarian-minded person, I want to throw a libertarian message out there and see what the reaction is. I mentioned already that the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., correctly, I believe, is being very hard on Russia because they're looking at China and they want to deter potential invasion of Taiwan. Well, that same foreign policy establishment 10 years ago, 15 years ago, basically ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, did warn that expanding NATO to Russia's borders was a way of triggering Russian paranoia. And so people like Kissinger and others, you know, a lot of the foreign policy, you know, grand poobahs have said, you know, this shouldn't trigger Russian paranoia, but it will, and therefore maybe that should not have been on the table. Now, other people respond to that by saying, as Eamonn said, well, Russia thinks Ukraine should be part of Russia anyhow, so maybe Russia would have been an aggressor anyhow, but I thought that might be an interesting topic to go back and forth on. I mean, it's one thing to be totally unified against Russia now, but if we could rewind the clock and go back 10 years, could we perhaps have avoided this whole problem? by having a less expansionary attitude about NATO membership.
And also, if the audience has a take on that, we'll get to you. Let's get the first round from within the panel, and then we get to you also on this question.
Well, I thought that the European Union, for example, messed things up rather, rather amazingly when Ukraine was talking about joining the European Union. You know, they want the economic benefits of being part of the Union, and those are considerable. But as far as the European Union is concerned, you're either in or you're out. There's no middle ground. It's you know, there's a project and you have to sign up to it, and it's the euro and it's the single market and it's all the rest, no exceptions. And that was the wrong thing for that particular case. You know, what you needed is something which was much more subtle, where there's economic ties, but there's none of the political ties and things like that. So I think that was certainly a mistake, and that's raised hackles in the Kremlin. And also, I think I agree with you. I think NATO should have been clear that Ukraine was not going to join NATO. And I think that would have lowered the temperatures as well. Whether it would have stopped Putin absorbing parts of the south and the east, or seeing the strategic advantage of barging into Crimea and maybe going on as far as Odessa, well, I'm not sure that it would actually have done that. But yeah, the West messed this up pretty well.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Could Ukraine have joined the European Free Trade Area and sort of through the back door gotten closer ties to the EU?
Well, yes, you could, but that doesn't seem to be flavor of the month these days. The flavor of the month is, or was, it's diminishing, is the project, and you know, the United Europe, and to have, you know, one size fits all kind of Europe. So that's the problem there.
Careful not to touch the button.
Well, I heard some Ukrainian talk last week, 2 days ago, and they said their objective is making themselves economically strong. And so then they can, Russia would think twice before invading them. I think that's valid because I've been traveling in the Eastern European or the foremost communist countries since 1991, 92, and I've seen the countries developed when they are really cut off their ties with Russia, and they develop really fast. But they all have the same fear, like Estonia. Our friend took us to the border and said, the border is there, and the border areas, everybody speak Russian, so we're really worried Russia will come and take them, you know, take that territory. And then we were in Georgia, people were saying the same thing in Ukraine, but Georgia and Ukraine for a long time, just like today's Belarus, they didn't really cut clear their ties with Russia, so they didn't develop as fast. So Russia, you know, bullied them. But I don't think Russia is going to bully Lithuania or Estonia because they're stronger. I think that's what I heard from the people in Ukraine. That's what they're thinking in the future, and not really just counting on the West to react, to do this and that. I think that's a good thing. And if the West can help, it's really help them to change to a free market system and become strong economically. That's what Barbara is doing, so applause for that.
So, yeah, I don't think Russia needs an excuse to be, you know, to do what it does. I mean, if you look at certainly recent history, pretty much everything bad in the world is either directly done by Russia or indirectly supported by them. You know, they can use excuses like, NATO is talking about expansion and so on, but NATO is there to defend countries against Russia. I mean, what the war in Ukraine proves is what we already know, which is we need, to defend ourselves against Russia because they are an aggressor. And yeah, I think, well, actually, that's all I have to say on this point. There is a super chat question. All right.
So, by the way, this doesn't work again, or does it work? It does, okay. So, shall I?
I can.
But the audience won't hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Don't press the button. Did I press the button? No, I don't press the button. It's interesting. Before I ask the question, I will say this briefly. It's interesting how the West uses Sun Tzu when it suits them, and doesn't use Sun Tzu when it doesn't suit them. So, for example, the gentleman said, keep them guessing. That's one of the main principles of Sun Tzu. But Sun Tzu also says, know thy enemy. And the West has traditionally, don't you think, failed to understand, because the West perhaps pretends that everybody has to think like the West thinks and the rest of the world has another idea. Don't you think that's the problem?
Who wants to start? You look more decisive.
Well, I agree. I think it is a considerable problem. I think it's possible that all countries become absorbed with their own system, but I think certainly the West, we're very absorbed with our own system, our liberal democracy. We think it's fantastic, and we think it's so fantastic that we're astonished that other people can't see the benefits of it, and we think they must be benighted or stupid or whatever. And I think we have to realize that, yes, indeed, different parts of the world have completely different views on these things. And, Hong Kong was an example. I mean, I was actually in favor of doing nothing in Hong Kong in '97, not actually negotiating new treaties, because the Chinese didn't respect the old imperial treaties anyway. But of course, the argument was, well, without treaties, what happens if China sends in its armies? Our business people and citizens have, no legs to stand on. So Mrs. Thatcher decided there had to be an agreement, and I think that was probably a mistake. But I think it came as a complete surprise to us and to so many other people how China, in that case, simply did not see the value of Hong Kong as a free place, that it saw the commercial value of having the Hong Kong investment and the foreign investment in Hong Kong, but it didn't see the importance of Hong Kong being a free society in creating that wealth and that benefit. And I think one of the things that we really have to do in the liberal democracies is to explain not just how wonderful they are in terms of economic progress, but how they are utterly dependent and founded on principles of freedom, and that if people can act freely, then they will grow rich. And therefore, that is why freedom is so important. We've got to keep saying that over and over again.
I just have one comment about this. I think it's inconceivable that the West would ever launch offensive military operations against either Russia or China. I think the West's attitude, 99.99% is, well, we'll defend ourselves if we're attacked, but we have no intention of forcing a regime change in these other countries, as much as we might like to see it theoretically. The problem is, apparently, Putin and Xi don't believe that. And so the know thine enemy thing goes both ways. And how on earth can Western free countries somehow reassure these more unsavory regimes that they don't need to cause trouble because we don't intend to force regime change on them? I mean, is the U.S. guilty of doing that with small, non-powerful countries without nuclear weapons? Yes, we are guilty of doing that. We probably shouldn't be doing that. That might actually help reassure some of the bad, bigger countries that do have nuclear weapons.
I think one really powerful strategy the free country can do is just like Lithuania, recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign country. And I don't know US is behind this or not, but I heard from the people in Lithuania, US is behind this, but doesn't matter. This is definitely going to really trigger and Xi Jinping's, not trigger, but hurt him, because that's what they want the most, their face. Taiwan is part of China. From Mao to Deng Xiaoping to today, 70 years, that's the only slogan they hold on to. They have no reason other than that to invade Taiwan just because they want to claim Taiwan is still part of China. And I think when United Nations and kick Taiwan out, accept China as the representative of the whole China, including Taiwan, into United Nations, this is the biggest victory the Communist Party felt. And now they're so angry at Lithuania, but Lithuania is a good example. I think if other countries start doing this, they will be really, really hurt the Communist Party.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's great to know your enemy when you're at war or when there's a potential war. I think the West's main problem is we don't know ourselves. We don't know why we're right. You know, nobody thinks of, you know, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People think you have the right to somebody else's earnings and to identify as whatever gender you dreamt up this morning, and to never hearing opinions you may disagree with. So. Yeah, the West will, you know, will continue to lose because it doesn't have moral clarity, whereas, you know, the most immoral countries in the world, unfortunately, do.
I just wanted to ask Lee, that foreign policy establishment that I keep referring to seems unified in thinking that the so-called strategic ambiguity of what is Taiwan. You're saying that that strategic ambiguity should end.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Take a stand. I know that all the world organizations, the World Bank, all the other organizations under the pressure of Communist Party, now on their website, they don't have Taiwan listed as a sovereign country anymore. They say, Taipei, China, they don't even use Taiwan. Taipei is the city. Taipei, China, Hong Kong, China. All the businesses did that too, recent 15 years. And it's like fashion brand, bank on their website. Before they will say we have stores in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and in Shanghai, in China. They say China. And then Apple, for example. And now China, if you don't change to say Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, China, Shanghai, China, you cannot operate your business in China. So everybody for their profit, whatever, and they kowtow, bow down to the CCP's pressure. That's so wrong. That is so wrong. People need to take a stand. Business need to take a stand, and government definitely need to take a stand.
This is also foreshadowing the next panel, which is, do these governments really care about economic prosperity, and is this, because you mentioned that at some point the Communist Party had to choose prosperity, or do we keep the power in the party. And they choose, of course, to keep the power in the party. So let's see what our audience says. So thank you very much, Robert, and Equal to Reality, and Maria-Len, and all our super chatters, and Free Trade, Apollo Zeus. Thank you all for your contribution. So Christopher asks, why is Ukraine not already in NATO? Has it got to do with Ukraine nationalism? Well, part of it is that for a long period they had Yanukovych, who was someone who was loyal to Russia, so there was not much willingness in the Ukrainian political class or from that side of the political class to join NATO. But also to what you said earlier, is it that NATO really, quote, encircled Russia? First of all, there's this meme which shows the borders of Russia, and the encirclement is these two small countries at the north. So, I mean, is this really an excuse in terms of, does Russia really feel threatened? Like, what's going to happen? There's going to be an infantry invasion in Russia from NATO. And also, isn't NATO the one that tried to keep Ukraine, say, okay, we'll see what will happen? It's not that NATO was actively pursuing these countries to become a member. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the threat to Russia is to have missiles and troops on its border. And it was just like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But they have the missiles anyway. They were in Turkey in the past, and there are missiles that can reach them anyway.
Well, that is true, but they presumably don't want more. I can well understand that. It seems perfectly reasonable. But you're right. I mean, the Ukraine, by Russian standards, is a relatively recent concept, and it has different factions within it, some pro-Russia and some pro-Western, and it has had governments that have been pro-Western and pro-Russian. You know, Russia can see that this is something which arguably is theirs, and that it is it's an aggression of the West to prevent them taking it. In fact, but in terms of the NATO thing, I think that. Yeah, it's the possibility of having troops on your doorstep. I mean, we got agitated when there were troops on the doorstep of Ukraine, and we were right to do so. So it's not surprising, I don't think.
Nothing to add?
I don't have anything to add.
Not sure if this means people agree with me or
So
it's on.
yeah, I don't know why Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO. I know that generally the West, you know, we should be careful who our allies are and why. And but in the case of Ukraine, I do think it's sort of clear cut because of Russia and them being, you know, the biggest threat to world peace. But you know, there are times when it's complicated, like, you know, in Syria, who do you support, Assad or ISIS? They're both evil, and we should be against both of them. So, yeah, it's difficult. It would be very nice if we had like a clear divide of a few countries that are laissez-faire capitalist and a few countries that are, you know, dictatorships that we can just, you know, completely ignore until they fall. But yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
We have 3 more interventions in the audience. We'll start with the gentleman, then the gentleman at the back, then we'll return to you, sir.
Don't touch the button.
Did I touch it again? No.
Thank you. I'm here we are in London. Personally, I'm frustrated at all this media we have here in the UK consistently saying that Boris Johnson is having a good war. My question to the panel is really, what is the freedom movement's view of the value of human life? Because I personally felt that as soon as the invasion started, as soon as it was made perfectly clear, and it's great to have it confirmed by a man of Dan Mitchell's status that under no circumstances would the US seek to invade another country or obviously even defend Ukraine with troops. Surely, as soon as this war started, we knew we were going to be facing horrible losses of civilian life. I'm shattered at the degree of these atrocities. Every day we hear about women and babies that have just been born, being blown up. For goodness sake, surely the correct freedom variant response would have been to sit down with Zelensky, Ukrainian government, saying, we're not going to defend you, we're going to throw you a few missiles and tanks. Good luck. You're bound to lose thousands of civilians. For the rest of my life, we'll have stories of 6-year-old girls growing up with their legs blown off. Surely we should just have organized, to save human life, a transition of power to Putin over the whole of Ukraine.
So your take is we should have intervened more directly, or we should have pushed for a ceasefire, which basically means Putin would win what he wanted?
Really, I'm trying to phrase it in the interrogative. It's a question. What is, here we are, a free market roadshow event, what is the freedom movement's approach to the value of human life compared with these trade-offs?
Thank you.
There's absolutely no question we value human life, but you have to look at the short term and the long term. In the long term, we have to stand up to aggression. We have to establish the principle that aggression, the use of force, does not pay. When people use force, even though you know that there is going to be a bloody war and that people are going to get killed, you still have to do something, because if you don't do something, then more people will get killed and more people's lives will be ruined in the long term. So you have to stand up to that principle that aggression does not pay.
There would have been much less loss of life back in the 1940s if the UK had just surrendered after Dunkirk. But presumably that wasn't the appropriate option. I'm sure that potential loss of life in Taiwan could be avoided if they just said, okay, China, here are the keys, come take over, you're in charge. Some things are worth fighting for. And arguably, in the long run, that actually does save lives because it stops future aggressors from behaving badly. But even if there's is a net loss of life, I don't want to live under tyranny. I'm thankful I'm in a very well-armed country, so I don't think anyone's going to invade us.
Should a European or an American die for Ukraine? An American
Well, that's a separate question. One of the reasons I was skeptical of the idea of NATO expansion, well, first of all, there's no more Warsaw Pact. But beyond that, do I want to die to defend South Ossetia, or however you say it, in Georgia?
Yeah.
Do I want to die to defend the territorial integrity of the Donbass in Ukraine?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I don't want to risk nuclear missiles flying over the Arctic because of countries that only 0.5% of Americans could even identify on a map. But that doesn't mean that I don't think Putin is the bad guy.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be offering help and helping the Ukrainians defend themselves and raising the costs of Putin's misbehavior, and of course also potentially, hopefully deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan. It's not an either or 100% thing. Foreign policy, it's very easy as an economist to say, higher taxes bad, lower taxes good. In foreign policy, I think it gets much more complex because you're basically trying to predict the irrational movements of different humans in charge of different countries.
And of course, if you're Polish, where you put the line in the sand is different, because suddenly what's happening, let's say in Ossetia, is more relevant to you than. So this is also an interesting question. How big should NATO be, and what should be the role of the United States in it? But let's not open this can of worms now.
Okay, I just want to ask another question. But history showed us the death by foreign aggression against another country or nation is far less than the death caused by internal, within the same nation, like the Koreans and the Germans and East-West and in China and Stalin in Russia. What can other country do about that? Right now, Xi Jinping dared to crash down Shanghai is because the focus is in Ukraine and Russia. And during the Wuhan lockdown, whole families got wiped out. And they say only 5,000 died. It's times 1,000 times more. And nobody, the international community don't say anything because that's within China. So my question is, if it's not a foreign aggression, then it's nobody else's business. But human life, you said human life is precious. Human lives are suffering, dying in Shanghai. People are starving. People are dying sick people dying in front of emergency room or hospital because they're not allowed to go in.
Or what about the Uyghurs?
Yeah, the Uyghurs, the Falun Gong practitioners, and that's my question. I don't know.
So, yeah, I think we should fight for the very reason that we value human life. That's why we should fight against tyranny and aggression and countries that, invade relatively free countries. It's, I think an hour into the panel, I can quote Ayn Rand for the first time. She said, life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. Life is not just, you're not going to get killed in a war, so it doesn't matter if you're living under tyranny. It does matter, and I think we should stand up for freedom. On Nikos's point, should any Americans or Europeans die for Ukraine? People can volunteer to fight in that war. So definitely, I don't think the U.S. should send their own army into the war. But people who, for whatever reason, think this is worth risking their life for. I think there can be rational reasons for that. They should do that.
Before we go to the gentleman, there's a super chat from someone nicknamed Free Trade. Thank you for your contribution. This looks generous, although I don't know the currency, but thank you very much anyway. So the question is, how much of the government budget in Taiwan is spent on defense right now? Anything less than 100% seems suicidal. So I don't know the specifics, but I know that Taiwan there's this metric that counts how good an army is. It ranks relatively well. It's something like top 30 in the world, and some small countries like Greece is high in that ranking because they have very powerful opponents. So does anyone know if Taiwan has a military capacity to deal with China?
So I'll let Lee answer the first question. I'll just answer the second question. I don't think 100% of their government spending should go on military. And also, I think, if there is all-out war there, Taiwan won't win that unless the West supports them.
True.
Well, Taiwan, I don't know the English word, the young man, 18 years old, have to...
Conscript.
Yeah, Taiwan has that. So they do have a military, and they are trained, well-trained, equipped with help with the United States, but it's a very, very small place. Even if everybody become armed, like Ukraine now, all the men, there's still very small number. So I think it's more important that Japan and South Korea, they really worry about Taiwan more than anybody. And especially Japan, they were the one really tried to support Hong Kong, but not the government, but the citizens. So I think if China attack Taiwan, invade Taiwan, and I think we will get more help from Japan.
Google is my friend here, and he tells me that there are 170,000 active duty military personnel. So, as you said, compared to the military of China, this is something very small. But with Ukraine, you saw how some days initially of strong resistance, of heroic resistance, can change the atmosphere and the energy around how we deal with this conflict. Remember Zelensky when he said, I don't want an escape, I want ammunition, how this changed how the international community faced Ukraine. So it's not always about how effective your army is in beating the enemy, but how long they can hold, so then that your allies or would-be allies can rally around you.
I was just going to comment that probably the biggest surprise to the Washington foreign policy and military establishment was how ineffective the Russian military has been. And they're now wondering, there are discussions in DC, is this just something that is endemic to totalitarian societies, and Eamonn was sort of hinting at that. In other words, is the Chinese military, even though it might be 20 times bigger than the Taiwan military in terms of actual fighting capacity, maybe it's only twice as big. I have no idea what that answer is, but the fact that Russia has done such a weak job, I mean, I would say 90% of people in Washington, D.C. who work on these issues expect Kyiv to fall in the way that Afghanistan did. And here we are, weeks and weeks and weeks later, and Russia is scrambling simply to now just get the eastern and southern part of the country.
And that's good because it's made an invasion of Taiwan less likely.
Well, I happen to know a lot of military officers because I live in Hawaii, and they were my friends. And I asked them, I thought China is much weaker and militarily wise than United States. And from the corruption, from their really messed up structure and system. Then I asked my friends, they said, but I cannot tell you, but I don't think you're right. And also I read some articles from the Foreign Policy Journal. They said US is not ready. If the war starts with China, they say US is not ready. I don't want to believe that, but I read officially, and I, get the other channels and hear that. That's unfortunate.
And the question, of course, is at what level are we talking about? Are we talking about a local, small-scale conflict in an island? Are we talking about big conflict with conventional means? So it's almost unimaginable how a conflict with China would look like. Like, what would be the theater of the conflict? Are we talking about something in the Pacific? So,
yeah, that's a good question. But I think if U.S. get involved to help Taiwan, it's not going to be just very local.
It's going to expand. Right. Yeah. Shall we go to the gentleman at the back, and then we're going to return to the gentleman in the middle?
How should former aggressor nations be rehabilitated, and at what pace? Have we let previous aggressors, I'm thinking here of Japan and Germany, absent themselves from the world stage militarily for too long, opening the door to the next aggressor? How do we repeat such an error in the future with our current crop?
Nice question. Who wants to start?
Well, there already are discussions about whether Russia should pay to rebuild Ukraine. What happens if some oligarchs or the military take out Putin? At that stage, the weak Russian economy, which is basically, what's the famous line? It's something with a gas station. There's some famous line. It's like a third world country with a gas station. Do you want to sort of repeat the Versailles Treaty where maybe we wouldn't have gotten a Hitler if it wasn't for the heavy reparations? I mean, Putin's the bad guy here. Now, of course, the Russian people are supportive of their own army, just in the same way. I think that's just inevitable. People are patriotic. They support their armies. They support their countries. But if Putin's gone and Russia goes back, as I was saying early in my initial presentation, if it becomes a normal country, I'd almost rather the EU and the US pay to rebuild Ukraine and then hopefully convince Russia, okay, we're not going to bleed you dry, but you got rid of your bad guy. Now become normal, become a good country. We want you to be free and prosperous. We don't want you to be the enemy. And maybe the US and the EU picking up the rebuilding tab would be a better idea. Of course, by the way, Ukraine has a lot of self-inflicted problems. In the economic freedom of the world, it's ranked number 122. That's even lower than Russia. So one thing that the West should insist upon after giving all this help to Ukraine is we should insist, okay, from now on, you're going to copy the Singapore tax system, You're going to copy the Dutch regulatory system. You're going to copy the Hong Kong trade system. You're going to dollarize or have a currency board with the euro or something like that. Basically force Ukraine to get rid of all the corrupt big government cronyism that has held their economy back. That seems like a very small demand that we should be making of Ukraine, because they are definitely, in terms of their domestic policies, not a country we should be applauding or saying anything nice about.
I think that's also the voice from Ukraine. Earlier I mentioned, they said we want to help to get economically strong by introducing free market.
They haven't done it since 1991.
That's what they're saying when the war finished. That's what they're looking forward to.
So, yeah, I don't have a good answer for how to rehabilitate countries. I think Dan's answer is pretty good, and yeah, I think that we have many bad examples of how not to do it. Japan was probably one of the better ones or less bad ones. Yeah, I don't mind if a country does what Japan and Germany did, that they don't have like a strong military for many, many decades.
It's interesting, in Japan it was basically, we're going to write your constitution. In Iraq was, have free elections and see, is it going to be the Ba'athist who's going to win? Anything goes.
Yeah, the Bush doctrine of exporting democracy.
Exporting democracy. Gentleman over here.
Do you think that the greatest failure, our failure, is that we continue with the position on we and the others? That we constantly talk about we and the others, about military solutions? I'm totally against this situation of we and the others. My family killed Jews. My wife is Russian. Her grandfather was killed by a German soldier. And I'm married to my wife for 28 years. I love her very much. That teaches me something, and I think perhaps, don't you think that should teach the politicians of the world something about it? Not anymore, we and the others. There's no we and the others, it's only us.
Can I ask you though, shouldn't we draw a line in the sand saying, your ideas make you another? So your ideas, whatever you are, we are on the other side. Shall we? Yeah, let's go this way.
Well, I think on this panel we are very much of the opinion that the world is full of people, and that the fly in the ointment, unfortunately, is governments. And when you talk about governments, yes, it is we and they. When you talk about people, we're all in the same boat. And the remarkable thing since 1990 is the growth of world trade, and how that has firstly enriched people who were on in dollar-a-day poverty, how it has brought on countries in the Far East and other regions, and how it has increased the understanding between different peoples and the travel between them, and so on and so on. And that is a good strategy. When people are trading together, it's much more difficult to go to war. And it is governments, and it's authoritarian governments in particular, that go to war, because they see this as a question of land, not a question of principle, not a question of freedom. So I think it's our criticism really has to be of governments, and to say that we want governments to be as small as possible, so that ordinary individuals, billions of them throughout the world, can collaborate together every day in ways which benefit all of them, and then we wouldn't be in this position.
I think you have a good point. I have to remember, because when we say we and them, it's about China, it's not the Chinese people, but Xi Jinping and CCP. And Russia, we probably talk about Putin. And so we are human beings, we, but the dictators, that's the evil we have to eliminate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with Nikos as well. The separation of us and the others, it's not a deterministic thing. It's not a racial thing or a issue of borders. It is about ideas, and so the people we put in the category of the others. Iran, for example, I can imagine. If there's any country in the Middle East I can imagine having a decent regime, it's Iran. But they are right now one of the biggest enemies. So they're of the West. So they're definitely in the category of the others, and I hope they jump ship and come over to our side.
Okay, so we don't have any parting words, so shall we call it a day for the first panel? So thank you very much for your comments, thank you very much for your participation, also to our audience, which looked more to be on Razi's hard line and saying that no, Russia didn't need any excuse to attack Ukraine. But next panel, shall we say in 10 minutes?
Yeah, something like that. It'll also be live on the YouTube channel, so we'll be there in a few minutes.
We're going to discuss Bastiat's, which is not a real quote, but that cool quote that says, when goods don't cross borders, then armies will. It's not a real quote, but it's a cool quote, so let's not let reality disturb a nice story. So see you in 10 minutes.